Hey guys, welcome to another Warframe video, and today I want to show you my new Saryn setup that I randomly put together yesterday to test the new Saryn Rework Rebalancing Revisited, because it ended up being really good. But before I do that, let's quickly go over the changes that were introduced with the newest update, which is 22.20.7. So by far the biggest change to spores is that your initial spore target will spread spores on death. But there are a few more cool changes on top of a couple of bug fixes. So first of all, your spores will no longer be removed if the enemy goes temporarily invulnerable. This is mostly a case when the enemy gets corrupted by a fissure. They made your spore damage drain every 0.5 seconds instead of continuously. And they fixed probably the most annoying bug, where if you were to cast spores on an enemy and at the same time your teammate were to kill that enemy, you would lose all your spore damage. And then they made a couple of changes to miasma, like increasing the duration by 1 second, lowering the energy to 75, lowering the damage per tick to 300, but most importantly, enemies affected by miasma will always spread spores on death. This one change on its own is huge, and it's why I decided to change my Saryn setup, so let's finally check it out. So it's still just a 3-forma build where I've reformatted the stance polarity into a dash and then I added a D and a V. I'm now running Energy Siphon as my aura because you no longer need corrosive projection because your spores are going to strip away armor and you're going to want as much energy as possible to spam miasma to spread your spores. Then to get a lot of defense, I'm using Aviator. This is mostly for Sanctuary Onslaught because if you keep yourself in the air either by gliding or just double jumping, you're going to have 40% damage reduction, which is absolutely huge. This will significantly reduce your damage taken in something like Sanctuary Onslaught, especially if you learn to glide cast, where you will jump into the air, start gliding by aiming down sights and then casting the ability. Next up, we have Constitution and Prime Continuity for a nice chunk of power duration, and this first of all helps Toxic Life so you don't have to recast it as often, but it also gives you more duration on miasma, so it gives you a bigger window where the enemies can die and spread spores. Then we have Stretch and Overextend it so that our spores spread in a much larger area, but also our miasma covers a larger area. However, this will kill your strength, so we need to do something to balance that out, and the easiest way to do that is to just run a maxed out Transient Fortitude, which will end up with you having 95% strength if you max out Overextended as well. But if you want to play this as a melee setup, you can switch Aviator for Power Drift and you will have more strength. Next up is Streamline, because even though they reduced the energy cost on miasma to 75, it's still a lot, so you want to bump that down a little bit, and we finish it off with Vitality for more health, and finally Steel Fiber for some armor. My weapon of choice for spreading spores is the IGNIS WRAITH, though if you don't have the WRAITH, you can just use the standard version and it's gonna be completely fine. I'm running Serration for damage, Split Chamber for multi-shot, Heavy Caliber for damage, Point Strike for crit chance, Vital Sense for crit damage, then Prime Shred, you can use the regular Shred by the way, for fire rate and punch through, which is the most important thing there. And I finished it off with Thermite Rounds and High Voltage for radiation, and this is sort of another layer of defense. Your Ignis is not gonna do a ton of damage in the later waves or against high level enemies, so this is just there to proc radiation on the enemies so they're fighting each other instead of you. If, however, you don't want to invest as much forma into something that's mostly just gonna be there to spread spores, you can take out a lot of the mods, because once again the damage doesn't matter, so you just want Split Chamber, High Voltage and Thermite Rounds for the status and radiation, and then some kind of punch through. And finally, since I'm not running Regenerative Mold, I need another way to recover health if I were to get hit by like a bombard rocket or something. And that's where my melee weapon comes into play. I'm using a Heavy Blade Zol called LIFEHUNT Sight, which I already made a video about, and the important mods here are Prime Fury and Berserker, so it hits as fast as possible. Then I want to hit as many enemies with each swing as possible, so I'm using Primed Reach, and then we have the most important mod, which is Healing Return, which at maximum rank heals you for 11 health for each status effect you have on each enemy you hit, which most of the time is going to be 3, Corrosive, Radiation, and Viral, so every time you hit an enemy with these 3 status effects, you're going to be healed for 33 health. Now, while this might not sound like a lot, all I have to do 99% of the time is to just slam into a group of enemies and it will catapult me back to full health. But that's not all the melee weapon does, because if you have a full build on it, it will be your source of single target damage. So you can either do quick attacks, which will do more than enough damage to take care of the beefier units, but one thing to bear in mind here is that while you're doing this, you are losing the benefit of Aviator, so you might want to swap into full melee combat and use a block combo instead. This, on top of providing additional damage reduction via blocking, will also do more damage. The one issue here is that the setup is extremely power hungry because you're going to be using miasma a lot, so it is very much recommended you use the Xenoric Focus School with the Energizing Dash passive, which, when you Void Dash, creates a zone of energy for 8 seconds, and if you run through that energy zone with your Warframe, it will restore 5 energy every second for 30 seconds. Now the gameplay here is pretty straightforward. Cast Toxic Lash, so you will always pop at least one spore when you damage an enemy, throw spores on an enemy, spread them around, and then cast Miasma to keep them spreading. And that's pretty much it. From now on you want to cast Miasma every now and then, so the enemies are always at half health from the viral proc, but they're also spreading spores further and further as they die. You don't want to overdo it with Miasma because, well, you're just gonna run out of energy if you use it too much, but also if you're running Onslaught, Cimaris will disable it. But that's not that big of a deal, because with the amount of duration we have, you can keep it ticking pretty much all the time, even in Onslaught. This setup is just bonkers. It will absolutely demolish missions like Hydron, where you might sometimes just run out of spores, not because you're not spreading them properly, but because you just kill everything on the map too fast. And it's just downright insane for farming focus in Sanctuary Onslaught, especially if you're running a booster like I always do. I almost maxed out my focus in one Onslaught run. Now, while spreading the spore strategy will work in the majority of missions in the game, it doesn't work in low-level missions, so what you want to do here is just spam Miasma, which does more than enough damage to kill low-level enemies up to sort of level 15, maybe 20. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. The build is just really strong and I would highly recommend you give it a shot. You don't have to use the exact same build. You can, for example, use something like Arca Plasmor to spread the spores, or any other weapon that you personally prefer. But as long as you stick to the sort of general idea of the build, which is to throw spores on an enemy and then initially spread them by Toxic Lash and keep them going with Miasma, you're gonna see some amazing results. And don't worry, if you don't have Saryn Prime, it will work on the standard Saryn as well. It may just require a little bit more Forma. And that's it, so I thank you very much for watching. As always guys, I hope you have enjoyed the video and it was helpful, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.